The time is now 6:19, and you're listening to the live local news on WORT.
Hyper-partisanship has taken over Congress, and as federal lawmakers drift to extremes on either side of the political spectrum, moderate and independent voters are often left out of the conversation. But it doesn't have to stay that way, according to nonpartisan organization Voters First Wisconsin. They're urging state lawmakers to implement Final Five voting for Wisconsin's congressional races. The reform, they argue, would make primary elections more competitive, encourage bipartisan cooperation, and allow voters to cast their ballots based on policy rather than party. Tracy Hunter, a volunteer with Voters First Wisconsin, joined our news producer Faye Parks to explain how Final Five voting works.
Voters First Wisconsin is a Wisconsin organization. It's completely volunteer run and nonpartisan, strictly nonpartisan and cross-partisan. And we focus on trying to improve the broken election systems. We don't focus in on any particular issue. We try to make the system work better. We've got three areas that we're working on currently. One is this Final Five voting that we're going to be talking about today. We also are very involved in trying to stem the money in politics problem, and also with the Fair Maps effort in Wisconsin. I got involved, I think it was in late 2021. I was driving in my car, feeling pretty depressed about things. We were still in the grip of the pandemic and political strife, and there was just a lot of bad stuff going on. And I happened to tune in on the radio and caught an interview very much like this, and they were talking about this Final Five voting effort. I don't even remember who was speaking. And I listened to it, and it made so much sense. They talked about what the problem is they're trying to solve. They talked about the solution and why it would work. And I guess my main reaction was I just, felt hope. And I thought, my adult kids are out of the house. I've got some extra time that I did not used to have, and I think I could pour myself into this effort.
Now, as you mentioned, one of your key initiatives is bringing Final Five voting to Wisconsin. This reform would end partisan primaries, expand voters' options, and proponents argue, make general elections more competitive in areas where one party typically has a strong lead. So how exactly does Final Five work, and what sets it apart from ranked choice voting?
It does have a ranked choice voting component to it, but as I described, you'll see that it's much more than that. So the way that it works is that we would make two changes to the way we do elections here. And we're going to be starting with congressional elections. So these are the people we send to Washington, our House members and our Senate members. And what would happen is we would make a change to the primary and then a change to the general election. The change to the primary is we would have a single primary where everybody is on the same ballot. No more partisan primaries. Some people call it an open primary. But really the important thing isn't that it's open, but that the top five vote getters move on. So everybody gets to vote for one, just like today, but you can vote for a candidate in any party, and the top five move on to the general election. So rather than today, we just have one from each party. The second change is in the general election. Now we have five candidates, right? So that's where we would use a ranked choice system, where everybody gets to pick their first, second, third, fourth, and fifth favorite candidate. And in order to win in the general election, you have to have a majority. You have to have over 50% of the votes. So they add up all the first choice votes in the general election, and if there's a majority winner, we're done. If not, then the lowest vote getter of the five is removed, and all of the second choices of the people that voted for that candidate now get added to the other four. And then you look again and see, do we have a majority winner? And you just keep doing that until there's a majority winner.
How would Final Five voting serve your organization's mission? In what ways might it solve political dysfunction and hyperpartisanship in Congress?
It really gets towards the incentives in Congress. Today, there's a strong incentive if you want to get reelected. You have to really make the people that vote in the primaries and the people that put money into the primaries, you have to make them happy to get reelected. And as an example, if you look at the House of Representatives, the U.S. House, about 85 or 86% of the districts are more or less owned by a party, just due to natural, demographic mix. So whoever wins the primary for those 86% of the districts wins the general election. There is no competitiveness in the general election. So who do they have to please? What are their incentives to get reelected? They have to make sure that they're doing whatever the primary voters and the party leadership and the big money is pressuring them to do. So in this system, that gets changed because to get reelected, you have to get a majority in the general election. So now you have to be people's first choice, and usually you have to get second and third choice votes as well. So they're forced, they're incentivized to try to have broad appeal and to listen to their, all of their constituents.
A similar reform is already in place in Alaska, though their primaries narrow down candidates to a final 4 instead of a final 5. What lessons can we take away from their model? Has it uncovered any potential drawbacks or unexpected benefits?
So as you said, Alaska is the first state that has this, and they did it through a referendum. There they are able to change their laws through referendum, and that's how they got it through there. It's been quite successful. They have 4. We are proposing 5. It really is not much different. We just think that adding one more might give a little more competitiveness there. So the examples of how successful it was, it's been in place, I think, 4 years there now. In the last session, some of the types of things that they were able to get done there, and this is a red state, and they have, competition, and the parties, do some arm wrestling. But in spite of all that, they were able to form a bipartisan majority coalition. So in other words, rather than having the majority party set the tone for what they're going to do during the legislative year, they have a bipartisan group that comes together, and they set the agenda. So they actually had a budget surplus. They were able to get election reforms done in the state, which not many states are even wanting to touch that right now. They improved their retirement system, and then really one thing I really like is that they inspired many more women to run and win. In fact, a majority of their state senate are female for the first time ever. And the indigenous people, which is a large percentage of their population, feel much more represented. So those are examples of, I think, what I would say the success story is in Alaska.
Now, critics of Final 5 voting argue that it would further complicate elections, and when ranked choice comes into play in the general election, would result in more ballots being thrown out. On top of that, UW law professor Nate Atkinson told NPR moderate candidates would most likely be eliminated in a Final 5 primary anyway, resulting in very little change from our current system. What's your response to those arguments?
First of all, as far as the complexity, the surveys that came out after the first Alaska experience were that most people found that it was not complicated, so they were able to do it. Now, they did a very good job of informing people ahead of time to make sure that that went smoothly. As far as votes being discarded, I'm not really sure I understand what they're saying there. I've heard that complaint, but I think it's just the opposite, right? In today's system, you get one vote, and if your candidate loses, it's done. You're thrown out. Your vote won't have any influence anymore. In this system, if your first vote gets dismissed because they were the lowest vote getter, your second is still alive and impacting the final outcome. The only time a vote is thrown out, if you want to use those words, is if somebody chooses to not vote for 4 or 5. So if they only voted for 2 and those 2 were removed, then that vote is removed. But that was their choice. They could have picked a 3rd or 4th.
And what about Professor Atkinson's prediction that voters would most likely eliminate moderates in the primary?
I don't think that's the case. Now, far be it from me to have a counter opinion with a professor, but it really is going to force the moderate candidate in each of the 2 parties to compete internally in their own party against the one that maybe would be less moderate. So they're going to have to compete for ideas. And if you think about who typically wins in the general elections, in the primary, the voters typically flee to the extremes because they want to capture that primary vote. And then they all immediately, the 2 winners, then they rush to the middle and pretend they're moderate, right? Because in order to get all of those votes in the middle, and it's like independents are like 40% of the vote, they have to give the impression or actually show that they're representing the independents. So I think that the moderates will stand a very good chance because they're the ones that are going to get those second choice votes and those third choice votes.
Final 5 voting has gotten a fair bit of traction in the state legislature over the last few years, with lawmakers on both sides of the aisle voicing their support and even collaborating on a bipartisan bill last session that would have implemented the reform in congressional elections. But it was never scheduled for a floor vote. Do you expect the issue to be taken up again this session?
The choice was made, the decision was made to not introduce it in the current session for a few different reasons. And like you said, in the previous session, it had strong bipartisan support. We had 23 or 24 supporters in the state legislature, and it was equal number of Republican and Democrats that were sponsoring it. It did make it to, like you said, to both chambers. They even had hearings that went quite well. They never got out of committee. And that's not surprising. When you make changes like this, it often takes several pushes before you get across the finish line. We chose, actually the legislators chose not to reintroduce it this session just because there was so much going on. There were so many controversial things that they were dealing with. They didn't want to add election reform into the mix. Plus we had the new maps being drawn. In the next session, in 27-28, they will be reintroducing it. We haven't lost any of our sponsors. In fact, we've gained some. And the final set of changes to the Senate makeup due to the redistricting will be done. So we think that it's going to be a much more balanced legislature, and it'll have an even better chance of passing the next time through.
I've been speaking with Tracy Hunter, a volunteer with nonpartisan organization Voters First Wisconsin.